The palace of the dragons stood tall and bright, filled with fire, gold, and glory. Every hall shined with the power of the Dragon Emperor and his strong sons. Warriors bowed to the Crown Prince, nobles sang of the second prince's victories, and the youngest daughters were praised for their beauty and gifts. Yet in the middle of this shining family, one shadow was always forgotten. The youngest son of the emperor lay in his chamber, a place cold and silent, far from the joy of the palace. His scales were pale, his body weak. He was called the dying son, the prince who would never fly, never fight, never rule. Servants whispered that he was a curse to the royal bloodline. His brothers mocked him in secret, his sisters avoided his sight. Even his father, the mighty emperor, gave him no more than a cold glance. Every morning, he coughed fire sparks that burned holes in the sheets. The cough shook his chest, his wings trembling as if they would break. Yet nobody came to his side. The healers visited once, then left, declaring that nothing could be done. Since then, he was left to fade, ignored as if he was already dead. But someone watched. Not a noble, not a dragon warrior, but a human janitor. The janitor worked quietly in the shadows of the palace. He was a man with a bent back, worn hands, and old scars across his arms. Nobody noticed him as he cleaned the ashes in the halls, washed away the blood from jewels, or carried broken armor to the furnace. To dragons, he was less than air, nothing more than a tool. But his human eyes saw what others did not. He saw the prince. On one lonely night, the prince struggled to breathe. His fire cough turned to smoke, and his body fell weak against the stone floor. His golden eyes dimmed, and his claws scratched the ground as if begging for help. Outside his chamber, guards stood like statues, ignoring the sound. The janitor passed by with his bucket. He stopped. He heard the sound of pain, sharper than any scream. Against his fear, he stepped inside. The young dragon prince lifted his head weakly, surprised to see a human in his chamber. His voice was faint, broken. "Why are you here? You are not allowed." The janitor looked at him, silent for a moment. Then he placed his bucket down and walked closer. "I am here because no one else is," he said in a low, rough voice. The prince stared. No dragon ever spoke to him with such honesty. For a moment, his pain was forgotten, replaced by confusion. "You should not care. I am nothing. Even my family think so." The janitor shook his head slowly. His hands trembled, but his eyes held strength. "A life is never nothing. Even a small flame can still give light." The words cut into the prince's heart like a blade. He wanted to answer, but another cough of fire stopped him. The janitor quickly took a cloth, dampened it with water, and pressed it to the prince's mouth. For the first time, someone helped him. That night, the prince survived. Not because of his family, not because of dragon healers, but because of a forgotten human. Days passed. The janitor continued his work, but each time he passed the prince's chamber, he would pause. Sometimes he left a jug of water. Sometimes he placed herbs on the table, herbs no dragon cared to notice. Slowly, the prince grew curious. Why was this human helping him? One evening, as the torches of the palace burned low, the prince spoke again. "Why do you risk this? If my father finds out, he will punish you." The janitor kept cleaning the floor, his back turned. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the echo of the hall. "I have seen war. I have seen both humans and dragons die. I know the value of saving, not destroying." The prince fell silent. He had heard stories of wars long ago, when humans and dragons fought for the sky. But he had never met anyone who lived through them. He began to ask more questions. The janitor answered with simple words, never too much, but enough to open a door in the prince's mind. For the first time, the forgotten son did not feel alone. But shadows grew inside the palace. The brothers of the prince noticed that he was still alive, still holding on. They whispered to each other, plotting in silence. The council of elders muttered that a human's presence near the royal bloodline was dangerous. The emperor remained silent, but his silence was heavy, like a storm waiting to fall. The prince did not know this yet. All he knew was that in a world where everyone ignored him, one man saw him. One human with scars, one janitor who carried buckets and rags, had given him a reason to breathe again. And deep inside, the dying son felt something he had never felt before. Hope. But hope is a dangerous fire. If left uncontrolled, it can burn the whole palace down. The forgotten prince lay on his bed that night, staring at the stars through the window. His chest still ached, but his eyes shined with a new light. Somewhere in the darkness of the palace, danger waited. Yet he whispered to himself, remembering the janitor's words. Even a small flame can still give light. And in that whisper, the story truly began. The palace woke with the roar of dragons as the sun rose over the mountains. Courtiers and guards filled the halls, and the emperor's strong sons walked with pride, their scales shining like armor. Nobody paid attention to the man who carried a bucket of water and a broom across the marble floor. He was a human, a servant, the one they called only when there was ash or blood to clean. To the dragons, he was invisible. His name was never spoken in the palace. To them, he was only the janitor. But behind his tired eyes, there was more than silence. His back was bent, his step slow, yet each scar on his arms told a story of battles long past. No one cared to ask where those scars came from, but the janitor remembered every wound, every flame, every cry of war between dragons and men. He had learned to live quietly, sweeping corners and washing halls, never speaking unless ordered. But his heart was not as quiet as his lips. He noticed what others ignored. He heard what others pretended not to hear. And above all, he saw the pain of the emperor's youngest son. Day after day, he watched the forgotten prince struggle to breathe, his wings trembling, his fire turning into smoke. He saw the boy's eyes, golden but dim, searching for someone who would see him as more than a dying curse. One afternoon, while scrubbing the steps of the great hall, the janitor overheard the laughter of the other princes. "Why does father still keep him alive?" one sneered. "He cannot fight. He cannot fly. He cannot even stand without coughing," another mocked. "Better if he disappears," whispered the third. The janitor gripped his brush tightly, his knuckles white. He kept his head down, but inside his chest, old anger burned. He remembered how many humans had been mocked, discarded, and destroyed by dragon pride. He remembered the flames of war. Yet when he looked at the forgotten prince, he did not see an enemy. He saw a boy who wanted to live. That night, the janitor returned to the prince's chamber with a small bundle hidden beneath his ragged cloak. The guards, half asleep at their posts, paid no attention. They never noticed humans. The prince was lying weakly on his bed, coughing again. Sparks fell from his lips, burning small holes into the blanket. His breathing was shallow, his claws trembling against the stone. "You again," the prince whispered when he saw the janitor. His voice was faint, tired. "Why do you keep coming back? You are only a servant. You should not risk this." The janitor placed the bundle on the table and opened it. Inside were green herbs, dried leaves with a sharp smell. He poured hot water into a small cup and mixed the herbs in, letting the steam rise. "Drink this," he said simply. The prince looked at him with doubt. "What is it?" "It will calm your fire," the janitor answered. "Not forever. But it will let you breathe for tonight." The young dragon hesitated, then reached out with shaking claws. He took the cup and drank. The taste was bitter, strange, unlike anything from the healers. But soon, his coughing softened. His chest felt lighter. For the first time in many weeks, he drew a full breath. The prince stared at the janitor in wonder. How do you know this?" The janitor lowered his eyes. "Because I have seen it before. In the war, many dragons burned from the inside, their fire choking them. Humans learned to ease it. I remember." The room was silent except for the slow crackle of the torches. The prince studied him carefully, his weak body trembling less now. "You were in the war," he said softly. It was not a question. The janitor nodded once. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of memories too heavy to share. The prince leaned back against his pillow, his mind racing. For years, he had been treated as useless, as nothing. But this man, this human janitor, had given him more than medicine. He had given him proof that someone cared enough to try. "I should not trust you," the prince whispered, though his voice lacked strength. "But you are the only one who looks at me like I am not already dead." The janitor did not answer. He simply bowed his head and began to clean the ashes scattered across the floor. The prince watched him quietly. Something stirred inside his chest, something unfamiliar. It was not fire, not pain, but something softer. Hope. But beyond the walls of his chamber, danger grew. His brothers whispered of ways to remove him, to end his shameful existence. The council grew restless, sensing weakness. And somewhere in the shadows, a pair of watchful eyes had noticed the human janitor entering the prince's room too many times. The bond between them had only just begun. Yet already, it was seen as a threat. The days inside the palace passed like a slow river, yet for the forgotten prince, each night felt like a battle for breath. The medicine the janitor brought eased his pain, but it was not enough. His body still trembled, his wings still felt heavy, and the fire in his chest still burned too fiercely. One evening, as the moonlight poured through the tall windows, the prince spoke with quiet urgency. "This will not last. Your herbs keep me alive, but they do not heal me. Why do you help me? Why not let me die like the rest of them want?" The janitor stopped cleaning the stone floor and looked up. His eyes were tired, but his voice was steady. "Because I know what is happening to you. Your sickness is not a curse. It is something different, something your kind does not understand." The prince tilted his head, his golden eyes sharp despite his weak body. "What do you mean?" The janitor stepped closer, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Long ago, in the war, I saw dragons burn from the inside. Not from wounds, but from fire too strong for their bodies. Healers could not help them, but humans learned ways to calm the flame. I believe your fire is not killing you. It is changing you. If we can control it, you will not die." The word struck the prince like lightning. Changing? Not dying? Could it be true? His heart raced with both hope and fear. But how? The janitor glanced toward the door, making sure no guards lingered near. Then he leaned closer. "There is an old chamber beneath the palace, a place forgotten by most. There are herbs there, hidden in the cracks of stone where dragon fire never touched. I know the way. But I cannot go alone. You must come." The prince's claws curled tightly into the blanket. His body was weak, but his spirit longed for more than a slow death in silence. For the first time, someone offered him a chance, not just to survive another night, but to live. "I will go," he whispered, though his voice trembled. The following night, the janitor returned with a small lantern. Its light was dim, just enough to guide their steps through the shadowed halls. The guards at the prince's door dozed, never imagining that the dying sun would dare leave his chamber. With quiet steps, the prince followed the janitor, his body shaking but his eyes burning with determination. They passed through narrow corridors and broken stairways, deeper into the forgotten parts of the palace. Dust coated the walls, and spider webs hung thick in the corners. The air grew damp and cold, carrying the smell of stone and old ash. At last, they reached a hidden door behind a fallen tapestry. The janitor pushed it open, revealing a dark stairwell curling into the ground. "Here," he whispered. "This way." The prince hesitated. His heart pounded as he stepped down into the darkness, guided by the faint glow of the lantern. Each step felt heavier, but inside his chest, a spark of strength kept him moving. At the bottom, they found an ancient chamber. Cracks in the stone walls glowed faintly with strange moss, and in the corners grew herbs unlike any the prince had seen before. Their leaves shimmered softly, as if holding the memory of moonlight. "These," the janitor said, kneeling to gather them carefully. "These can balance the fire inside you. But they must be used with care." The prince reached out, touching one leaf gently. For the first time in his life, he felt something other than weakness. He felt possibility. But before the moment could last, the sound of footsteps echoed above. Heavy, sharp, and filled with authority. "Guards." The janitor's face grew tense. "They followed us," he whispered. The prince's breath quickened. If they were caught, the punishment would be severe. Not only for him, but for the human who dared to defy the laws of the palace. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. The prince clutched the herbs tightly in his claws, his mind racing. For the first time, he was not afraid of his sickness, he was afraid of being discovered. And in that moment, he realized the truth: his life was no longer his own. His survival was now tied to the human who had given him hope. The palace grew restless. Whispers ran like smoke through its golden halls, whispers of the dying sun who somehow refused to die. Servants spoke of late-night movements, of the human janitor's strange visits to the prince's chamber. Guards muttered that they had heard footsteps where none should be. The council of elders gathered in secret, their eyes cold with suspicion. The emperor's other sons noticed too. The eldest, strong and proud, sneered when he heard the rumor. "Let him cling to life. He will never rise," he said, though anger burned in his voice. The second son laughed cruelly. "If he survives, it will only shame us more. Perhaps we should help him meet his end sooner." The forgotten prince knew none of this, but he could feel the weight pressing against him. Each day, the air around him grew heavier, the looks colder. Yet at night, when the janitor returned, he found strength. The human taught him quietly. He showed him how to breathe slowly when the fire surged, how to steady his claws when his body shook. He told him stories of men who faced flames without wings or scales, yet fought with courage. "You must learn control," the janitor said one night as they sat in the hidden chamber below the palace. Herbs glowed faintly around them. "Your fire is wild, but not hopeless. If you command it, you will live. If not, it will consume you." The prince listened with fierce attention. For the first time, he was not only surviving, he was learning. His body still weak, but his eyes shined brighter with each passing night. But danger moved closer. One evening, as the janitor guided the prince back to his chamber, shadows stirred in the corridor. Blades flashed in the torchlight. The prince's own brothers had sent assassins, dragonborn warriors, to end his life quietly. The prince staggered, his chest tight, his breath burning. He could not fight. The assassins moved in swiftly, claws ready to strike. But before the blow could fall, the janitor stepped forward. His old hands gripped an iron rod, his stance steady like a soldier once more. With surprising strength, he blocked the first strike. Sparks flew as claw met iron. The assassins snarled in shock, not expecting resistance from a human servant. "Run," the janitor growled to the prince. But the prince did not run. For the first time, he refused to be only a weak shadow. With trembling effort, he let his fire surge, not a blast, but a small, controlled flame that pushed the assassins back. His chest ached, but his eyes blazed. The assassins retreated into the dark, hissing promises of return. The prince collapsed against the wall, gasping. The janitor steadied him, his hands strong despite their age. "You see," he whispered. "You are not helpless. Even now, you can fight." The prince looked at him with fierce gratitude. For so long, he had been ignored, mocked, left to fade. But tonight, he had stood against death, not alone, but with someone who believed in him. Yet in the shadows of the palace, the council learned of this night. The emperor's silence grew heavier, colder. And soon, both the prince and the human who saved him would face the storm that was gathering. The attack in the dark corridors left the prince shaken, but also awakened. For the first time, he had felt the fire inside him respond to his will. Weak though he was, he had pushed back death with his own strength. That moment stayed in his heart, burning brighter than the pain. The janitor watched him closely after that night. He brought more herbs, but also more lessons. In the quiet chamber beneath the palace, he taught the prince how to breathe with patience, how to focus his mind when the fire threatened to escape. "You are not broken," the janitor said, his voice steady as stone. "Your body carries a power that dragons do not understand. They see sickness. I see change. But only with control will you live." The prince listened with all his soul. He practiced each night, his claws trembling, his wings twitching, his breath heavy, but slowly he began to master the flame. At first, only a spark. Then, a stream of fire that did not choke him. Each time, the janitor's eyes gleamed with quiet pride. Yet outside the hidden chamber, the palace grew colder. The emperor's council grew suspicious, whispering of human corruption. His brothers grew restless, their envy turning to fear. And the emperor himself, silent and unreadable, began to watch the prince with new eyes. One evening, as they returned from practice, the prince asked softly, "Why do you do this? You could leave me to die and live safely. Why risk your life for me?" The janitor paused in the torchlight, his face half-shadowed. His voice was low, filled with memory. "Because I once had a son. He was human, weak in body, but strong in spirit. He died in the war. When I look at you, I see the same fire in his eyes. I could not save him, but I will not turn away from you." The prince fell silent, his chest tight with something he could not name. For the first time, he felt more than hope. He felt a bond, a thread that tied his life to the janitor's. But their bond was dangerous. One night, the emperor summoned his council. His voice thundered across the hall. "My son clings to life. But I smell human hands in his fate. This cannot stand." The council bowed in agreement, and punishment was prepared. For the human, it would mean death. For the prince, exile or worse. The prince did not yet know. He only knew that his fire was changing. It was no longer poison. It was something new, something powerful, something waiting to be set free. And as he stood beneath the stars that night, he whispered to himself, his eyes blazing with light, "I am not dying. I am becoming." The Emperor's throne room was a mountain of gold and fire, its walls glowing with the heat of dragon pride. On that day, the hall was filled with silence, broken only by the sound of the Emperor's breath, deep and heavy like thunder. Before him stood the forgotten prince, his scales still pale but his eyes burning with a light that no one could deny. Beside him, quiet and steady, stood the human janitor. The council whispered angrily. His brothers glared with sharp smiles, eager to see him fall. The Emperor's voice rolled across the hall, cold as stone. You have allowed yourself to be touched by human weakness. You bring shame to my blood. You will end this foolishness, or you will be destroyed. The prince's body trembled, but he did not bow. His wings stretched, weak yet defiant. He looked at his father, then at the rows of nobles who had ignored him all his life. His voice, though rough, carried strength. All my life, I was called useless. All my life, I was left to fade. But I will not fade. I am not dying. I am changing. And I will not give up the one who saved me. Gasps filled the chamber. The janitor lowered his head, ready to bear the punishment. But before the Emperor could strike, the prince stepped forward, his fire rising. It no longer tore at his chest. It flowed with control, shaped by the lessons he had learned. Flames circled him, not wild, but alive, like a crown. The eldest brother roared and leapt forward, his claws glowing with fire. The prince met him with a stream of flame that pushed him back across the hall. The second brother lunged, but the prince's wings, though weak, lifted just enough for him to evade, answering with fire that cut through the smoke. The court erupted in chaos. Dragons shouted, the ground shook, but through it all, the prince stood tall. He was still frail, still marked as dying, yet in that moment he shined brighter than all of them. The Emperor's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp. You dare defy me? The prince's flame rose higher, his golden eyes locked on his father. His voice thundered back, not with arrogance, but with truth. I dare to live. Even a dying flame can light the future. And I will not let mine be forgotten. The hall was silent. Even the fire in the braziers seemed to bow before the strength of his words. The janitor stepped beside him, his worn hands empty, yet his presence stronger than any weapon. Human and dragon, standing together against the weight of tradition and pride. For the first time in the history of the palace, a fragile son and a humble servant changed the air itself. The Emperor did not strike. He only stared, his silence heavy, his thoughts hidden. The forgotten prince, once ignored and broken, now stood in the center of the hall, a fire born not of power alone, but of humanity, hope, and defiance. His story was no longer a whisper in the shadows. It had become a flame too bright to ignore.